Carrie Zenz with Allen Interactions. And this is Innovation in Building Resilience, Fostering Post-Traumatic Growth in Individuals and Teams. So if you're joining us, just make sure that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. A lot of times it defaults to just all panelists. So that will ensure that everyone can see what you have to say today. We want to make sure this is a very interactive and lively discussion. We're going to give it a few minutes before we kick things off. So as usual, we love it if you would just share maybe a hi and where you're from, what the weather's like. I am in Southwest Minnesota and we got a bunch of snow yesterday. So it's very white and beautiful here actually today and cold. It's rainy in Pennsylvania, sunny in Chicago. Hi, Kathleen. And I do have a helper with me today, so he may be making little appearances here and there. That's what 2020 is all about, right? Everything's melding together. Ontario, Canada. Ooh, 18, cold, it's cold. Yeah, the snow was really, really pretty yesterday. South Dakota, Robin, probably not too far from you. I'm about an hour 15 from Sioux Falls. Lansing, Michigan, oh, thank you. Thank you, Ruth, for saying that. His cuteness, you know, is a gift when, you know, the moments where they really, really try you. It's always nice when it helps when they're cute. Makes it hard to get so upset. But he's a good little boy. He's in a red sweatshirt. I don't know, maybe he did put a cape on. It's hard to know. He's changed his pants 3 times today already, so. Applause to kids in Pittsburgh. Yeah, I agree. We're all juggling a lot and dealing with a lot this year, and you know, honestly, have to give ourselves. I tell myself every day, gobs of grace. Gobs of grace. Oh, Phoenix, 70 and sunny. That sounds awesome, Jeffrey. I love Arizona. I haven't been there in a long time either. I need to get back there. Choose grace, not guilt. I love that, Smokey. I love that team motto. That's awesome. Again, I'm Carrie Zenz with Allen Interactions. This is the webinar, Innovation in Building Resilience, Fostering Post-Traumatic Growth in Individuals and Teams. I think we might be at the top of the hour here. Yep, 12:01. So we're going to get going here. Just make sure that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees so we can all see everything you have to say. You can send it to just panelists only if you're having some kind of technical issue, but try to just keep it on all panelists and attendees. And I've got some people here in the back end here helping me out. Claire is one of them. Rich Peterson's another one. So they'll be helping us out. I just wanted to brief you quick on Allen Interactions. Our mission is to enhance the human mind and spirit through meaningful, memorable, and motivational learning and performance experiences. And our everything is helping businesses optimize performance together. We're most known for custom learning and instructional design based on the work from our founder and CEO, Dr. Michael Allen. But we do so much more than that. And as you'll see here, these are all the services that we offer, from custom learning to digital engineering, strategic consulting, government services, staff augmentation, and our Allen Academy. So if you want to learn any more about those services, we just launched a new website, and you can go to alleninteractions.com and do that there. We want it to be very interactive and a lively discussion. So any questions, any insights, any comments that you have, please share those in the chat. We will be doing several polls today. We will also be posing some questions, asking you to give us your answers and responses in the chat window. So please, anything you have, get it off your chest, share it. We are here to collaborate and, really grow together. Today, I'm excited to announce our two presenters. We have Dr. Christina Quiticus Bars, and we have Steve Larson. Dr. Bars, there's so much to say about her. She's not just a wonderful person, but she's an experienced HR, organizational change management expert, coach, professor, teacher. Her sweet spot is in building systems that support, engage, and inspire cultures with measurable and sustained results. And Steve Larson is a senior solutions architect here at Allen Interactions. He's a seasoned professional in sales leadership with a consulting background, and he has background in change management, adaptive learning, and problem solving. So I think I've covered everything there is to cover, and I am going to turn things over to Steve.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction, Carrie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's our pleasure. And we really appreciate the time you're taking out of your busy day. And hopefully you'll come away with an upliftment with the topic that we've chosen today. But I just want to cover off on the webinar goals as we kick things off. First and foremost, we want to explain the various forms of trauma as they present in the workplace. We know that with COVID entering the scene in early 2020, that's a big deal. And it's affecting all of us personally and professionally. Number two, we want to speak to the strategies to help you successfully create a culture of workplace support. So important as we spend so much time away from our loved ones and families to be able to go to an environment where we just feel supported and heard, and that's so critical to our sense of self and our satisfaction with our employers. Number three, we want to share some tactics that help proactively engage employees. We know that with a remote first environment, and we're all here on Zoom today, it can become super challenging to really measure engagement and to really have people feel connected. And last and not least, we want to describe what Carrie outlined from the beginning, which is to have this become meaningful, memorable for you personally and for your teams, and more importantly, measurable over time so that it sticks. It doesn't take too long for you to open up the headlines from your favorite news article, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, your local papers. And as I mentioned in the outset, really 2020 from February, in this far left article from the Wall Street Journal talks about tracking the outbreak. And we move from left to right. And then we look at the 16 million people plus that were furloughed and lost their jobs. The GOP stepping forward with government to look at corporate taxes and provide some stimulus to help families. And then we look at really some iconic companies and organizations needing to fold their tents and close their doors with Neiman Marcus and others. So the headlines have been very, very significant. And as we transition to the next slide, it obviously has a really significant impact on the shifts at home. We know that the labor market has shifted dramatically, and we've all been quarantined and tried to really learn how to execute and deliver from a home environment with kids running around and dogs and husbands and sick kids and really parents and families becoming really, really stressed and needing some relief. And obviously that relates to our children as well at home, our loved ones who are trying to learn remotely, and that become really challenging and stressful for children. And last but not least, families, what's most important to all of us. This is an opportunity to really become close, or we're seeing, unfortunately, families being torn apart and having a lot of turmoil at home. So I think we can all relate to this. And as we look at the next slide, what this also brings an added layer of stress is what's happened as of last week on the 3rd, looking at the government presidential race and having the sense of who the right candidate might be. And the number one stressor, as this statistic brings to light, is will we be better off than we were from the previous generation? So again, that connectivity back to our families. Next, we look at the image here that really reflects perhaps how we feel internally, or how we're looking at the rubble that in this picture is framed in Dresden, Germany. This beautiful cathedral, called the Church of Our Lady, was constructed in 1743. And it sat there as for the German people as a symbol of suffering. And what makes no sense about this, much like the pandemic that came out of nowhere, is that Dresden really had nothing to offer in World War II in terms of garrisons and supplies and other strategic reasons to bomb this beautiful city. And so for 50 years, this rubble sits as a reminder of that event. Well, that all changed in 1990 as people started to gather from around the world and think about how they could rebuild, reconstruct, transform this beautiful edifice. And so that began with the Brits, who actually, and ironically, were the ones responsible for the bombing. They brought forward 100 million euros as part of a $220 million project to see here this beautiful, new, reconstructed, transformed edifice in Dresden. And what you see that's remarkable is this cathedral is now mixed and blended with both the rubble from the old and new sandstone, or from the new construction and from this new building. And as you see on the right-hand side of the slide, inside of this beautiful cathedral is just that, beauty from rubble. And that's exactly what we want to do today in this transformative webinar series that Dr. Barson and I will be conducting. And I'm going to turn it over to her to really walk you through the webinar objectives that I stated from the outset.
Hey, thank you very much, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Chris.
Okay, great. The little green thing didn't go around me, and I just wanted to make sure that I was like being heard.
Yeah, I just want to say we do have a poll that we wanted to launch. So whenever you want to do that, if you want to do that now.
That's fantastic. Let's do the poll. So before I talk, we're going to ask you to answer the poll that you see on the screen. Basically, just want to understand where in level set where everybody is on the concepts of organizational trauma, post-traumatic growth, and trauma-informed communication. So we're going to let everybody answer that. I think we have about 56 people that have checked in today. So let's see where we're at. Well, it's looking good, Steve. We have somewhat comfortable for this, which means that we're going to have a very good, robust conversation. Just like Carrie said earlier, and Steve reiterated, what we like to do when we're doing these types of webinars is talk about and open up for questions in the chat. So what you'll see is you're going to, during the whole conversation, we're going to post questions in the chat and ask you for your questions and your answers. And also, if you have a question on a slide or have a comment, they're going to be monitored throughout the whole thing. So let's see, we have it as, for how comfortable are you with organizational trauma? 87% said they were somewhat comfortable. How comfortable are you with post-traumatic growth? And 71% of you said that you're somewhat comfortable. And how comfortable are you with trauma-informed communications? 66%. So I think we're in a good spot. What do you think, Steve?
I do. I think this is going to be a really great conversation, and we really encourage you to input your comments in the chat section, and we will share these best practices and comments after the webinar.
Fantastic. So how do I make it stop? Do I do the boom? Awesome. So trauma is a public health issue of our time. Now, one of the reasons why, as you can see, I love this image because it builds on what Steve was just early talking about, the rubble from the cathedral in Germany, and then how we had blue skies afterwards, and the post-traumatic growth of something that was beautiful came from something so horrible and difficult. So usually organizational trauma is a subject matter that's within healthcare organizations, school campuses, first responders, mental health, and social services. However, the mass crisis level that we're experiencing globally has now made it pervasive into our organizations. And leaders are now challenged with, how do we handle the trauma that our employees are experiencing? How do we create those psychological safe environments for people to continue to learn and grow? And how do we avoid creating toxic work environments? So our first question in our chat is, during this period of mass scale crisis, what are your organization's biggest challenges? So I'm going to be interested to see what people have to say, Steve.
Yeah, this is a big question, Christine. And I think that for those listening and watching this is a really great opportunity to just be transparent. And I think what you'll see is we're going to help you turn these concerns into strategic initiatives that will really help strengthen you and your teams.
So as people are answering in the chat, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Please continue, and then Claire and Carrie will let us know what the what some of the themes that are showing up. Okay. Fantastic. So
there's a lot of responses, but I'll let you keep going.
Are there a lot of responses?
Yeah, there are.
Fantastic.
Layoffs and trauma of those left, fear of the unknown, keeping people safe, managing stress, keeping team dynamics working remotely, just the unknown in the daily life weirdness, stress, technology, being agile with customers and their struggles, lack of human interaction and connectedness, feeling like you belong, a lack of that, I think. Finances, dealing with stress of the additional workload, anxiety, again, fear of the unknown, pivoting services from face-to-face to virtual to remain effective, being dependent on leadership that doesn't have full empathy and grasp of the situation, burnout, fatigue, loss of social capital, converting all their trainings to online or other forms of communication to online only for everyone's safety. One of the last ones, biggest challenge, emotional quotient at risk and fear of the unknown.
Wow. And that's
higher workload, emotional health, exhaustion, communication. I think that's most of them.
Wow. Well, that's great. Not great that everybody's experiencing all these horrible things.
Right.
Great that everyone is sharing and feels psychologically safe to share. And it gives us a lot of information to inform this conversation. And also this is part of a series. We'll be doing 3 webinars. This is our first webinar. The second one will be in December and the third one will be in January. And interspersed will be different blogs and a white paper to help support on post-traumatic growth. Because this issue, as just shared with Carrie, is huge. And to answer it in a 50-minute webinar might not be realistic. However, it's our first step. It's like that story of the starfish. You can't save them all on the beach. You can save the one that you threw back. So experiencing trauma changes the way a person perceives the world. It will cloud or change their perceptions, their thoughts, and their feelings, and it filters them through their experiences. So the clear benefit of developing your leaders and also your employees about organizational trauma helps them to understand and actually process that it's normal for them to be going through this high anxiety and this stress, that experiencing that survivor's guilt of the furloughs and the layoffs, to understand that that disconnectedness is something that is real, it's not imagined. And by providing those groundings, that helps them to want to be able to move forward and creating that ability to see beyond the trauma. The difficulty that we're having with this global pandemic is that it doesn't end. It doesn't seem to be ending, does it, Steve? No. It seems to be continuing. And we're having multiple levels of trauma going on in the organizations and in the community and globally. So trying to unpack this as an organization will require robust ways to deliver learning. I think one of the earlier people said was taking all the learning and making it into e-learning to keep everyone safe. We moved very quickly to do that, but how engaged are our learners? What are the expectations and the follow through? And now this was a temporary fix, but it's starting to become the norm. And how are we going to handle that? So here's a quick primer on trauma, Trauma 101. So there's different types of trauma, emotional trauma that you may experience, and it's similar to the trauma that you experience to your body. The other types are acute, chronic, and complex. So acute is like a single incident, a car crash. That would be an acute case of trauma. Chronic would be over periods of time. So for example, the chronic trauma of serving patients, COVID patients in a hospital setting, that would be chronic. And then complex are multiple traumas happening at the same time. So events. So as Steve was talking about that first slide that talked about all the different things that we're experiencing right now globally, and that's at a macro level. And then when he brought it down to what's happening at home, we're experiencing multiple levels of high trauma at the same time. So that's complex trauma. And there's familiar names that you've probably heard for trauma. There's post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's when one person experiences a life-altering event that impacts the way they think, they feel, and manifests itself in extreme distress and fear. Now, that's direct trauma. That's when somebody is in the actual activity or life-changing experience. Indirect trauma would be secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. Secondary traumatic stress. Secondary traumatic stress is when you are witness to somebody else going through trauma. So we'll go back to the healthcare. In healthcare, the clinicians are prone for post-traumatic stress syndrome. They're experiencing, as well as even the patients going through a chronic illness, that it would be the first level. Secondary traumatic stress, that would be the EVS, the support people, security, even the executive leaders helping and supporting people. They're witnessing the traumatic experience. They're not in it, but they're indirectly witnessing. Vicarious would be hearing about the traumatic event. So that may be a family member talking to somebody about how difficult it is to be working or experiencing in healthcare, or taking care of patients, or holding a patient's hand as they pass because their family can't be there. That would be vicarious trauma. This intergenerational trauma, which is trauma that's passed from generation to generation, and that's based on societal. And then there's compassion fatigue and burnout, which those two are also examples of trauma and output of trauma. Compassion fatigue is a quick onset, while burnout is a longer experience. So resiliency, and I'm actually going to read the American Psychological Association's definition because they say it best. It's the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress, be it family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. Simply said, resilience is a person's ability to process trauma and then return back to their previous mental healthy mindset. So that's bouncing back. So you've gone through the trauma and you come back, you're nimble, you're flexible, and you're able to absorb the trauma and process it. So again, we're coming back to chat because we love hearing from you. How do you care for yourself during times of crisis and chaos? Again, we were talking about how this is in individuals and teams. How do you stay resilient? There's 4 types of resiliency building. There's connection, wellness, healthy thinking, and meaning making. So hopefully that will prompt you. And let's hear what people have to say about how you care for yourself.
Ruth says meditation, exercise, yoga, nature, friends, music. Yvonne says regular walks in nature. Christina says yoga, meditation, connection, a lot of meditation, exercise, sleeping well. I think that's a big one. Sleep is huge. Therapy, meditation, diversions like coloring. I find coloring very relaxing and therapeutic as well with my kids. So yeah, exercise, self-care, sleep. Sorry, that's my little one in the background. Listening to music, prayer, keeping on a schedule as much as possible, trying to stay consistent with your daily schedules. Being around positive people, listening to soft music. Talking to my family on Zoom, chatting to friends and family.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. So think of, like, as you're thinking about how this is creating for you, times of crisis and chaos. One, it's being a leader and modeling that behavior for those around you to stay resilient and help also maintain that level of courage, bravery, and strength going through and leading your team through post-traumatic growth. Also, it gives us the ability empathetically through human-centered leadership to think, how are we going to take that and exponentially grow it to create that same feeling for your teams and for your organization. So thank you so much for sharing that. So post-traumatic growth. I took this picture as a stock photo, but I love this photo because it's a candle being reflected multiply, almost rippling out via a mirror. And it reminds me of Edith Wharton's quote that, how do you spread the light? I'm loose paraphrasing. Spread the light. You can either be like the candle, or you can be the mirror that reflects the light. And as leaders, as I stated earlier, we can be the ones that reflect that light. When we see the strength of our employees reflect that, we also can be that light in how we model ourselves and our behavior to help people power through that post-traumatic growth. So what is post-traumatic growth? So earlier we stated how resiliency is the ability to go through the trauma and return back to your original mental state. Post-traumatic growth is when you go through the trauma, and it's the trauma is so extensive that it exceeds your ability for resiliency. It exceeds your resilient capabilities, and it calls upon for you to process that trauma and to find additional ways to process and to move forward. And what it does is that when you're on the opposite side of the trauma, you have a new perspective, and you have a new way of looking at things, finding meaning, and even a new sense of self. Many people that go through extreme trauma, be it a illness or a wartime, they come through, and post-traumatic growth is something that is been studied and shared in ancient texts and religion. And and just recently, 30 years since 1990, it's now become part of the science of talking about transformation through post-traumatic growth. So that's what post-traumatic growth is. Am I being clear? I just want to do a check. Steve, did I explain it correctly?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is fantastic going on right now, Christina, in the chat is Christine Pruitt made a wonderful point in the chat that we need to process our feelings and acknowledge them in order to be resilient. So I like that a lot. Great call out.
That's fantastic. It's exactly it. We have to process our feelings and make space for others to process those feelings as well. And in the past, people would think, oh, there's no place for feelings in the workplace. Unfortunately, our workplaces are now our homes. And we're now in dispersed locations and working from home, that there's no clear delineation between home and work. And also, if you're doing human-centered leadership, it's approaching the entire human being, which means the logical, the cognitive, the conscientious, the unconscientious, and the emotional. So let's go on to the next one, which is human-centered approach. So leading the whole employee can be challenging at times, especially when they're experiencing or processing those feelings. It can be a bit prickly, and it's hard to embrace them when they're demonstrating behaviors or symptoms of traumatic stress, anger, withdrawal, lashing out, different types of behaviors that make it difficult to have them be approachable. So the idea is that as leaders, we become those rocks, that foundation, and create that safe and supportive environment. And it's leading with humanity. And human-centered leadership isn't something new. The idea of human-centered leadership is present in design thinking. It's present in lean manufacturing and lean methodology. There's people and process. And it's also in servant leadership, where you're empowering those around you. So great examples are, when people set that example of leadership, so emotional intelligence, is leading self and managing self, then also going out to relationships and building relationships and social awareness. And by having those four parts of emotional intelligence help you to connect to others and practice compassion, empathy when doing human-centered leadership. I really love this image. It's from the book called Hug Me, and it's about a little cactus that keeps trying to find someone to hug them. So I thought it was really appropriate for social distancing right now. So Richard Boyatzis is an emotional intelligence pioneer and thought leader. He's done extensive research, studies, even MRIs, mapping the brain regarding the different portions of emotional intelligence. He's an incredible thought leader. And I love this quote: "We know that human beings are hardwired to unconsciously pick up the emotions of others in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second." Now let's process that for a minute. 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. That's incredible. Those are micro expressions. Now, when you have micro expressions, it's that emotional leakage that comes across the face, so that no matter what the nonverbal cues are, or what people are saying, what goes across your face is people pick up on that, and you're able to read it and then adjust yourself to how you're interacting with those around you. Now, you're all thinking this, the global pandemic and social distancing. This is a challenge because with virtual meetings like we're doing today, masks, 6 feet apart, remote learning, sometimes we have the screen on, sometimes we have that camera on, sometimes we don't. And that really does impact how we're reading one another and how we're connecting. And unfortunately, what that means is that it's making it more difficult for people to feel that connection. So we're creating this disconnect, and people are not having that ability to have that resilience that they had before and be able to get together, to talk, and to read one another. How many times have you read a text or an email and wondered what that tone was? Well, that tone is that 40th second that goes across the face. So this is what's really important about understanding how we're teaching empathy, how we're teaching compassion, and how we're helping people in trauma-informed communication. So what is organizational trauma? So when employees experience a mass scale event, it really does shatter how they perceive themselves. It shatters the view, that lens that they see themselves, and it becomes blurry to see anything else. It changes how they see themselves, their position in the organization themselves, their role. Earlier, when we were asking people what some of the challenges were, they were just sharing, uncertainty. What's my role? How, my stability? Where's the organization? Is the organization, as Steve said earlier, some are shuttering. Are we going to survive the economic volatility? So those are the parts of with organizational trauma. And a mass scale trauma response is a result of a mass scale crisis. And it may trigger a group of physiological and psychological responses that include that heightened sensitivity and distress. Now, what does that mean? Well, when people have a heightened level of sensitivity and distress, they read more into what is happening around them. They've got into that flight or fight syndrome where they start to wonder and become paranoid about what's going on. Again, remember, now we're not as close to one another. We're not being able to see the full face or to communicate as often. Technologically mediated communication is creating, sometimes it's a nice buffer, but in this place, it's a dislocator. So how do we bring people together? And organizational trauma, when untreated, can chip away at employees' self-worth, security, health, and well-being, and ultimately erodes that trust bridge between the employee and the organization or the executives. So that's basically, how do we create that connection between and teach and help create an environment of psychological safety. Now that I have this book, Organizational Trauma and Healing. Authors Pat Vivian and Shanna Horman wrote extensively about organizational trauma, and they talk about the risk of organizations becoming stuck. So if you don't recognize that organizational trauma and the impact within your organization, it may become embedded. Now, when it becomes embedded, then the chance of now evolving into a toxic work environment. Remember, we talked about all the feelings people are having and the behaviors that people may demonstrate when they're going through trauma. If they are, production is low, they're disengaged, they are questioning their self-worth or their professional career choices, are they, they're feeling disconnected. Well, if that's negatively impacting how the organization is and it's left unchecked, and people are still at that heightened level of distress, you're going to have an environment that fosters negativity. And as the relationships start to erode between the teams and the organization, it affects the viability of the organization. So I liked in their book, this is an eye chart, and yes, you will receive, after this this webinar, you're gonna receive an email with with the audio and visual recording of this presentation. So you'll be able to see this. This was on page 17. But what I liked about this particular chart was that it talks about, in one where it says the clinical perspective, that's how individuals process trauma. And then the organizational perspective is on the left-hand side or right-hand side for organization. And you can see, if you go very quickly through that, how there's some parts of like what an individual experiences is very common to what an organization will experience. While at the same time, the way that they're susceptible to, for example, susceptibility to PTSD or STS, which is secondary stress, traumatic stress, depends on the individual history and other factors. Now we look over at the organizational part, and the same thing for organizations. How many different things is your organization going through? Is that, you think about, financial, if there's been furloughs, the civil unrest, COVID-19, sending people home, bringing them back. Those are multiple levels of trauma that are happening to your organization. And both sides, from the individual to the organization, and some people think of organizations as organisms, living, breathing organisms. So them to have those feelings and the feelings of great joy, as well as to be susceptible to isolation and despair.
Hey, Christina, one of the great chat questions before you move on comes from Anisha Dar, who asks, do you believe stress management or neuroscience sessions or training should be made part of an associate's new hire orientation? Very interesting question.
I love that question. And in a beautiful world, I would think that would be a fantastic thing to do, is to teach about, depending on what type of organization is she in. Could she share that?
Feel free to, if you're open to that, Anisha, we'd love to know what type of organization that is. If not, I personally think that would be, in this post-pandemic or pandemic world, how great would that be to instill resiliency from the very outset of a new hires orientation. And she is in healthcare.
Fantastic. And actually, at the end of this webinar, we do show a case study from a healthcare organization that has set themselves up for proactively working with people through stress. So I think it's a wonderful idea to help them understand, especially the neuroscience, and in healthcare or any organization where it's data, providing the data so that people understand that this is not that this is actually real. A lot of times people think that we can just power through the emotions, power through, and not experience or not have that self-awareness. So I think it is really important that through orientation, when you're understanding your mission, your vision, and your values of your organization, part of your values is empathy and compassion, and having that empathy and compassion will help the organization. Now, one of the things I should point out, and I'm really glad she asked this question, is that secondary traumatic stress for organizations that value love, compassion, empathy, they're actually more susceptible to compassion fatigue and secondary stress syndrome because they feel already for others that they are more susceptible to experiencing that. So it would make a lot of sense that as you're teaching those values, to also teach how to mitigate the risk, just like there's good that comes with the bad, to teach them for resilience, which again would be living to your values of compassion and grace.
One other point I love from Danielle Wheeler is taking that one step further, Christina, is teaching these skills in grade school.
Yes. I think it's fantastic. I think there's quite a lot of movement towards mindfulness for children. Actually, a very good colleague, friend of mine, teaches mindfulness for children, and it's teaching them how to be fully present and grounded, which is one of the, as a lot of you were talking about, doing meditation, yoga. Those are activities that keep us grounded and fully present. And when we're fully present, especially when you focus on the breath, if you teach a child to focus on their breath, like blowing bubbles, you can't think of yesterday or tomorrow. You can only think of that one moment. So that's a fantastic, I love that idea.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. So post-traumatic growth. So that's picking up the pieces, but how do you safely pick up those pieces? You know, I showed a shattering of a window and then trying to see, but as those parts fall, how do we help people make it to that next level? How do we help them recognize leaders, recognize that transformation? So it's helping leaders understand and recognize grief, shock, and possible depression, and then help them create a sense of normalcy and security. So for example, during Hurricane Harvey, I was in Houston at the time, and huge event, water of biblical proportions. And one thing that we created with our team was that we immediately created a 9 o'clock conference call. Every morning, everybody would call 9 o'clock in the morning. They would all call in and we would just do a roll call. If anything else, it was just to let to know everybody was safe. And actually, one of my employees called during the call to explain that he was in his attic because his house was flooding. We all told him to get out of his attic, and he got up on the roof and he was saved and rescued. But the idea is creating that consistency and that type of environment that people could feel safe, that everybody was in it together. So that's one of the parts. And now more than ever is is teaching and coaching leaders the importance of their visible presence. Now that speaks volumes. I know we talk about, there's that show, The Undercover Boss. Well, this is the time to be that not so undercover boss. That's the time to be fully present, sending email check-ins, texts, making sure that they are aware that you're there for them. If anything, it's just to say, I'm thinking about you. I hope you're safe. I hope you're well. And when we do this, we're going to help our organizations regain control and work through that psychological toll of organizational trauma. Now, innovation and learning is critical to meet the development needs of our organization. I know earlier some people were talking about how we had to quickly go to e-learning and bringing things online. Now we have, as it starts to become more of the new now, what are the other ways that we can teach and train people? What are other ways that we can be connecting and thinking of ways to move things quicker. So using design thinking and instructional design is a phenomenal way to quicken your process, answer to the organization, and have an iterative way of making innovation and education in a way that meets the needs. Not everything, people here, not everything's a PowerPoint, not everything is an interactive e-learning module. They might be things on rings or cards or a job aid, or even something that's a QR code that people scan that brings them to a YouTube video of 2 minutes that explains something. There's different ways that we can be sending information, and thinking about how we can broaden and be creative will help those feel psychologically safe and creative as well. So I love the story that Steve shared at the very beginning. Post-traumatic growth does not mean that we're better than before the trauma, because it means that we were broken. We were never broken. It means that we are different and we have new skills and perspective. And just like that cathedral in Germany that married the dark rubble, rocks, and stone as they rebuilt, they also mixed it in with the new limestone, making this beautiful mosaic. It's the same thing with our employees. Creating that post-traumatic creates this beautiful mosaic of our past selves and our knowledge and our insight, and our present selves of the information that we've learned and that we're able to grow and change and develop. So those are some of the things that, when thinking about post-traumatic growth, is that it can be a positive thing and setting that stage for success. So how do you recognize workplace trauma? So, we talked a little bit about the different diagnoses and different ways, but let's just talk a little bit about what cognitive, physical, emotional, and behavioral trauma that is happening. So the cognitive is how you're processing your information. Physical would be illnesses, would be chronic illness, and it would show up in the workplace as loss of time, frequent absenteeism, increased safety events, because people are not paying attention as much. Emotional would be, the emotional piece would be high strung, flying off the handle issues of, and in the workplace, it would be showing employees that are starting to have issues with substance abuse, again, absenteeism. Cognitive and behavioral would demonstrate in lost deadlines, missed deadlines, reduction of productivity. Those are the things those are the symptoms that you would start seeing. And we would recommend doing a root cause analysis to understand what's happening and then unpack it so that you have a better understanding of what's underlying. You don't want to say, oh, it's just because of COVID. That's very broad. By having it unpacking and talking with your staff about why we're having increased absenteeism, or teams are becoming insular. Remember earlier when we were talking about sometimes organizations or people tend to become inward. What's happening? If we understand the logic or the feelings behind that, like we said, recognizing our feelings, we can then address those feelings, meet people where they are, and then be able to talk with them and then rise them up. Yes. Okay, so the 3 M's is a model that Allen Interactions has had for wonderfully support for their CCF model as well, for our CCF. So it stands for meaningful, memorable, and motivational, and results in measurable gains. So our CCF model is context, challenge, activity, and feedback. Now, the idea though is that when we're thinking about engaging our learners, like I said earlier, we want to understand what is the emotional underpinning that's causing the behaviors, or the cognitive disassociation that's causing these behaviors. understand what they are, and then train to them or provide educational opportunities. It might not be training the employee themselves. It may be training the leaders to be able to create those safe spaces. It may be training, as earlier, creating ways to help people understand how to do self-regulation. So in addition to understanding how we create meaningful, memorable, and motivational learning in whatever modality that we use, we're going to talk about two things that we can use to help engage our employees. So one will be psychological safety, and the other will be trauma-informed communication. So as I'm talking about those, think about those 3 M's, about how you would create them to be meaningful, memorable, and motivational. So psychological safety is when an individual feels safe to become their authentic self, to be fully present without fear of negative consequences to their status or their career. Now that's really difficult, especially when you are in a heightened state of distress, to feel vulnerable. And creating those teams is creating a shared belief system that they feel safe for interpersonal risk-taking and they feel accepted and respected. So again, as a leader, when you start creating a stable environment that creates a feeling of normalcy, people will, just like a boat gets moored to a dock, even in rough seas, they're attached to something that makes it feel safe and keeps it safe. As a leader, that is what you're doing. You're creating that safe port in the storm. So psychological safety is a way to create that ability for people to feel authentic, and most of all, risk take and be creative and problem solve. Now, the 4 W's of organizational trauma-informed communication, and you're going to notice that these next slides are very crisp and clean. There's very little animation or images, because when people are in a heightened state of distress and trauma, they're more susceptible to stimulus. So the idea is that when you're creating this trauma-informed communication, you want to keep it as clean and as easy to read as possible, or easy to consume. No bells, no whistles. This is the time for very austere ways to communicating. Now, I'm not talking about taking the heart out of something. I'm just talking about the delivery. So the 4 W's are who, what, when, and where. So let's start with why. So the purpose of this particular W is to provide framing and content to the crisis communication and empowering the employees to make appropriate choices. By providing that context of why we're communicating with you, the prompts for you or for your leaders when creating their communication plan is, why is this important to this audience? Why are we communicating with you? You know, you could be communicating about if you know that there's a hurricane coming, if you know that there's going to be a shift in your organization for a merger and acquisition, which again is yet another way of organizational trauma occurs. You want to be able to explain why we're communicating at this point. And this gives you the opportunity to provide value for your employees. The W of when. Consistent scheduling of communication creates a sense of stability and predictability. Remember, everything else around seems uneven, unstable. There's a chance of disassociation because it's just too much, because there's no place to hold on to. So thinking about having something that people know that at 9 o'clock in the morning, there will be a huddle call. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, there's an email that comes out. Thinking about the best times to reach your employees. Now, this is also the time to think about off shifts, weekend shifts, locations and time zones. When you're creating your plan, think about when you're sharing your information so that it reaches everybody. W, what. Purpose is to provide, to prevent information overload. You don't want to provide information overload. The right size of information in digestible portions. Right now, when you are going through trauma, it's very easy to become overwhelmed. And if you become overwhelmed, you're going to just disconnect from the communication and not get that valuable information. So creating short information, short pieces of just critical information, kind of sifting between the need to know and the nice to know, and understanding what to share and how often is really important. And the last W is where. Now, it's a strong way to create feelings of that, stability and predictability that I've talked about, and I can't emphasize that enough. But the consistent location of that vital information is important. Like we said, you could have dispersed locations, and thinking about your multiple delivery modes to ensure conclusion across all levels and all locations. But if somebody is missing something, especially if shift workers or people that are working and they're not having access to their phone, is to understand where they can go and get that information at any time. Where is the easiest way for employees to locate and find that latest information? Also thinking about, if you send an email, does everybody in your organization have email? Sometimes frontline employees do not have email or a workstation, or they might have email and it might be on their phone or a personal mail. Sometimes when you have disaster plans, you have everyone's phone number to be able to send informational texts, but not everybody has text as well. So thinking about that when you're creating your trauma-informed plan is incredibly important. So as I shared earlier, wait a minute, I should stop. How are we doing, Steve?
I think we're great. Do we have a poll question that we want to ask the participants at this time?
I think right after this.
Okay, let's keep rolling.
Okay, so as I shared when Nicole, I think it was Nicole, was asking about how do you orientate people. So this is from Intermountain Health. And I really love this part of experiencing promises. So at Intermountain Health, they have these 3 pieces: always safe, always present, and always together. Now, with those 3, they have the proofs, like this is your evidence. This is how we're going, this is our commitment. This is how we're going to demonstrate or show up. We're going to be aware, proactive, and speak up when we're always safe. You see something, you speak up. You see something that might be like a stop the line. If you see something unsafe, you would stop the line. Proactive, if you see a risk, you're going to bring that up. And that's experience promise, always present. And remember, we talked earlier about leaders being present, leaders having a visual and visible, not so undercover boss presence in their organization. And that would be attentive, curious, and compassionate. Curious means having humble inquiry, asking the questions of those at the front line, how are they doing? And the questions that you don't know, open-ended questions and active listening. And then always together, as we talked about trauma-informed communication for organizations, being informed, connected, and collaborative, opening up to get people's information and ideas to help power through to a post-traumatic growth is incredibly important. And just like you said, Steve, what's our next question? So we shared a couple, and we're limited on our time, but for the organization and the people that have joined us, what strategies or tactics have you found successful in creating a culture of workplace support?
Fantastic. We have about 5.5 minutes remaining. So while you're inputting your answers into the chat, I want to make sure we wrap up in time. And let me just go over the key points of what Christina shared. Number 1, we explored the various forms of trauma and how they present in the workplace. So very important to recognize those, synthesize those, and react accordingly. Number 2, so important to have psychological safety. And Christina did a great job of helping to inform us around how we can create a culture of workplace support. And number 3, we discussed how to practically engage employees during mass crisis. This is so important, especially when we're remote, to want to feel, as some of you said in the chat, we want to feel engaged. We want to feel recognized. We want to feel important and that we're contributing to our organizations. And we want, more importantly, our leaders to be present, as Christina talked about. You know, I've always said that we are people before we are professionals. And I hope that you've been able to sense that throughout this webinar. And lastly, we went over the 3 M's. How can we provide an environment that's meaningful, memorable, and motivational in helping to build resiliency in our organizations? So the next slide, I want to introduce you all to an opportunity to, when you look at the slide that we showed from the outset, and that was the rubble of the Dresden Frauenkirche Chapel in Germany. This slide represents kind of how Allen Interactions is looking at rebuilding and helping transform organizations and teams just like yours that need help in transforming to become more adaptable organizations, to have more stronger, more resilient teams and individuals. And more importantly, at the end of the day, having our businesses with satisfied, happy customers, because they keep us in business, and that's why we're here. So with that said, whether it's people, process, or technology, we have a 90-minute framework that I want to invite you all to look at. Not so much the image here on the slide, because there's 9 different segments that we'll cover, but I wanted you all to see what a learning ecosystem canvas looks like. And that image to your left is exactly that. At no cost to you, over in the course of 90 minutes, we will help walk you through and provide you at no cost a readiness report, a metrics of impact status for you, as well as, most importantly, an actionable roadmap in bringing all of these teachings that are custom made and relevant for your organizations to help you become more resilient. And much like the Dresden Chapel, be that mosaic of old and new, and have a workplace that you truly enjoy being at. So with that said, we'll go to one more thing, and we would like, I'll have Christina just really kind of walk us through one more thing.
Okay, great. So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I thought I had muted myself while Steve was talking. So one more thing. What would number 2 of this series focus on? What would you like to see it on? Organizational trauma, post-traumatic growth, and resilience. What subject would you love for us to cover in our next webinar, which will be the first week of December? So after this event, you'll be receiving an email with the recording from this, also a link to subscribe to future events for Allen Interactions, and also, yes, yet another link on to ask regarding our 90-minute learning ecosystem canvas workshop. So thank you so much for joining us for this first webinar of the series, and keep an eye out for upcoming webinar in December. Up on the screen is our poll. Would you be so kind as to complete the poll so we can see how we did regarding organizational trauma, post-traumatic growth, and trauma-informed communication. Again, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again.